All right, we are recording. Anyhow, I would like to thank uh, everyone that is here for our Touch of Health Thursday night, first and third Thursday meetings. Although we won't have a third Thursday this month. We'll get back on that schedule next month. But we have tonight Dr. Milton Mills. And if any of you have read his bio that you have, he is more than qualified to be speaking to us about health. And one of the things I want to go beyond a little bit about Dr. Mills is what he has taught me before I ever met him. He has a program out there asking, in so many words, are we carnivores? Are we omnivores? Or are we herbivores? Now, I grew up on a dairy and I drank milk, I ate eggs, I ate meat, and loved every minute of it. And so when I saw that and when he went through the whole explanation of why we are a certain way through physiology, biology, and anatomy, uh, it hit home. And I tell you, when I found out that we were herbivores, it was it was all done for me. I was ready to change. So not all of us have that same scenario in that, but I tell you, Dr. Mills will convince you that we need to change our ways from the standard American diet. Anyhow, Dr. Mills, I'm going to open it, let you take it over now. You've got the screen. And at the end of your presentation, we'll open it up for questions and answers.
Okay. All right. Well, again, thank you guys for inviting me. It is.
Can we start with a word of prayer?
Sure. Absolutely.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to again learn about your health laws and learn that, Lord, what you have for us and how, if we get back to your laws of health, how we can have a health that would put COVID-19 to shame. Anyhow, that might be a little exaggeration, but Dr. Mills will be more than apt to be able to answer that question, I'm sure, because you are using him in a mighty way. Bless all those that have come. Let our eyes, ears, and hearts be open to hear you as you speak through Dr. Milton Mills. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Yes. And first of all, thank you for that word of prayer, because the Bible says Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega. He's the beginning and the end, and he's the source of all truth and all blessing. And God told us from the very beginning that when he created our first four parents, the progenitors of the human race, he told them what to eat. He put them in the garden and he gave them their directions for their diet. And we'll talk about that in more detail on the Sabbath sermon Saturday morning. So I would really encourage people to tune in for that. And there are very specific reasons why he did that. And I often liken it to when you go buy a new car, one of the first things that the salesman does when he gives you the keys is he puts an owner's manual in your hand. And that owner's manual tells you how to take care of that brand new vehicle you just purchased. Tells you what gas to put in it, what oil to put in it, how often to change the tires, and so on and so forth. And likewise, God gave us a body and he told us how to take care of it. And even after Adam and Eve messed up, he gave them some additional instructions. And science has come along and confirmed everything the Bible has been telling us for the last 5,000 years, 4,000 or 5,000 years, that a plant-based diet is the diet that promotes the greatest health and longevity. And the work that you just alluded to, Tom, on my lecture on Are Humans Designed to Eat Meat was specifically designed to help people understand why it's true that adhering to a plant-based diet promotes better health. And so what we're going to do tonight is we're going to explore the ways in which plant-based diets promote better health, help prevent disease, and can even cure and reverse disease. So with that, I'm going to hit share, and I'm going to click on this. And can you guys see this grid?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'm going to bring this up. Now you should all see a big blue screen, right?
Yes.
All right. So we'll go ahead and get started. So the title of this lecture, Diet and Health, Transitioning from the Standard American Diet to Food that is Good for the Body and the Soul. And as I always do, I start with a quote from God's Word. This is from the book of Genesis. He told Adam and Eve, "You shall eat the plants of the field." That's Genesis 3:18. So let's briefly talk about the leading causes of mortality in the United States and other Western countries. Well, if you look at what people are concerned about, you see things like this. He says, why, yes, I'm extremely concerned about the health effects of the radiation from Japan. You know, they had that problem with the Fukushima nuclear plant that had the meltdown, but pass me my bacon cheeseburger anyway. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that bacon cheeseburger is going to kill them much faster than any radiation from the Fukushima reactor plant. And that's really what he should be concerned about, not what's happening in Japan. Experts estimate that up to 80% of the chronic disease and premature death that we see in the United States and other Western countries could be prevented by making significant changes in our diets and lifestyle. And what that means and alludes to is converting to a plant-based diet. So I just want you to think back through your life to all of the people that you know who died or from a heart attack or suffered with cancer and diabetes and passed well before their time, and just realize that 8 out of 10 of those people could have lived a longer life, a fuller life, a happier, healthier life if they had eaten a plant-based diet. And that should give us all pause, because that means that there's so much suffering that could be prevented if we would only choose to eat and live differently. So I think one of the fundamental things that we have to do is we have to change the way that we look at food. Because most of the time when we think about food, we think about it in a sort of emotional or romantic sense. You know, we think about food in terms of the meal we ate on a first date, or food that we had at our grandma's house, or the favorite meal that a loved one may fix for us. But the fact is that food really is just a bunch of chemicals. And that they happen to be chemicals that our body can derive needed and important nutrients from. And in terms of chemical compounds that we'll put into our bodies, absolutely nothing comes close to the amount of food chemicals that we will ingest over our lifetime. Now, if I were to walk up to you and pull out a bottle of some clear liquid, pour it into a glass and say, drink this, the first thing you would ask me is, what on earth is that, Dr. Mills? Because you would know intuitively that you can't ingest some chemical without knowing what it's going to do to your body. Well, we need to learn to ask similar questions about the food that we think about ingesting. Not just, is it food, but what's in it? What is it going to do to and for my body. And our genes have had a much longer history, experience, and interaction with the nutritive chemicals that are in foods, as opposed to the pharmaceutical compounds that we are all too often much too ready to take in an effort to try to recover health that we may be losing because we're eating the wrong kinds of foods. So the influence of diet and nutritive chemicals on our health and longevity are mediated through their epigenetic effects on our genes. This means that with respect to preventing and treating diseases, the theoretical and practical benefits of understanding the relationship between food and health are enormous. And this is a quote from Dr. Mark Hyman. He says, food is not just calories, it is literally information. The food we eat talks to our DNA and tells it what to do. And that's what epigenetics is all about. The most powerful tool that we have to change our health is the environment, and the entire world is on our fork. So let's look at some health disparities that exist and talk about why they exist. And we see that stark health disparities exist in minority and ethnic communities that have been endemic and persisted for many generations. I apologize, but there we go. Okay. These health disparities are reflected in chronic disease rates that exceed the national average for both adults and children for a variety of diseases. And the net effect on communities of color is that many of these people have a lifetime that can be defined by poor health, limited opportunities for social advancement, and ultimately result in premature death. The roles that historical and societal wide racism and racial and ethnic bias have played, play in creating and helping to perpetuate these destructive and intractable health disparities may not be readily apparent to everyone, but they are nonetheless very real, oppressive, onerous, and unfortunately persistent in our society. When we look historically at how our government has dealt with racial and ethnic communities, we can define, a recurring pattern that results in cultural destruction and the destruction of individual and cultural identity by disrupting and or actively destroying traditional food production and preparation methods and the cultural heritage and identity means, modes, and themes that supported these practices that ultimately result in the poor health profiles that we see in these communities. So when we talk about racism, we have to understand racism has both individual and society-wide effects. Some of the most destructive effects of the systemic and systematic racism and racial profiling is on a society's collective view of the target groups, but also on the individual's self-image and self-esteem. Negative imaging oftentimes leads to the belief that the targeted groups don't deserve or aren't entitled to or aren't even capable of attaining better health or living healthy lives. And so when you hear that, African Americans or Hispanic Americans or Native Americans have higher rates of diabetes, heart disease, cancer, or they die at much younger ages, people just kind of shrug their shoulders and say, well, yeah, that's what happens in those communities. They don't eat healthy, they don't live healthy, they just die sooner. But that is the effect of racist socialization, to think that somehow that is acceptable or that is normal, and that is not, in fact, a result of what society is doing to these communities. Unrelenting negative messaging and images create an internalized self-destructiveness in individuals living in these communities that can manifest itself in four principal ways. First is what I call nihilism, and that is the belief that nothing you do will matter, and therefore, why take care of yourself? There is also what I characterize as normative post-colonization lifestyle and dietary patterns, and we'll discuss all these things in a little bit. There's the aspirational assimilation lifestyle and dietary patterns, and then there is racism-induced post-traumatic stress disorder, which is an epigenetically mediated altered gene expression. The society-wide effects of racism are reflected in governmental policies and standards that directly neglect, ignore, and harm minority individuals and communities in ways that ultimately result in poor health. And we're seeing this being played out right now in this society when we look at what's happening at this COVID relief bill debate that is going on. First of all, it has become clear that that first COVID relief bill that came out, nearly half the money in that bill actually went to large corporations and businesses owned by wealthy individuals. And even that portion that went to small businesses, most of that bypassed minority-owned businesses. So once again, people in communities of color were overlooked or systematically neglected by a program that was allegedly designed to help people in need. And now we see people are being faced with losing their homes. Many of them have already lost their jobs. They are struggling to find food to eat. And meanwhile, you've got Republicans in Congress refusing to even consider a relief bill to help these individuals. This is systemic racism in action. So nihilism, let's talk, is the belief that nothing you do will ultimately matter because the odds are so stacked against you, you can't win. So you might as well just have a good time until the end comes. It is a form of post-traumatic stress disorder. And that can manifest itself in drug, alcohol use and abuse. It may show up as poor eating habits. It can manifest as domestic and or social violence within the community, or a failure to monitor and take care of one's health. And there's also, it can be a historical distrust of the medical profession because of the ways in which the medical profession abused and misused and experimented on a community. And, you know, some of the egregious events that happened in the past within the African-American community has been, as we know, the Tuskegee experiment, but we now have a brand new manifestation of this happening to Hispanic immigrants being held in these concentration camps down south, where they were taking Hispanic women in and removing their uteruses without their knowledge or consent. And something that has not been discussed, but that was almost certainly a part of this, is that there is a high likelihood that those uteruses were then taken and implanted in women who were infertile but wanted to have babies. But that we'll have to wait for the truth of that to come out later. And I'm not just advancing a wild conspiracy theory here, ladies and gentlemen. There is some strong evidence that this was happening. And that's why the uteruses were actually removed and not simply, they simply didn't just tie these women's fallopian tubes. But again, that's fodder for another discussion. And with respect to the African-American community, people sometimes say, well, again, the reason there's so much more disease in the Black community is because they just don't take care of themselves well, or that they eat worse than everybody else. But the fact is that studies actually show the diets of African-Americans are really comparable to standard Western diets in terms of their composition. So when you look at what African-Americans are eating in terms of the amount of fat, the amount of protein, the amount of processed carbs and so forth, they're pretty much eating what everybody else is eating. Now, they may eat a little more red and processed meats or fried foods and sugar sweetened beverages, which is more consistent with a Southern style dining habit, but it's still pretty comparable to what Westerners are eating in general. But when we compare diets eaten by African Americans to and the resulting disease profile to Blacks living in West Africa, you see very stark differences in what happens with, let's say, diabetes and prediabetes. So in that chart that you see, and the green represents Black people living in the United States and Great Britain, whereas the yellow are Black people living in West Africa. Glucose intolerance can be thought of as pre-diabetes. What NIDDM stands for, non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus, which is type 2 diabetes that is directly related to one's diet. And what you see is that in West Africa, where people are still eating a traditional West African style diet, which is a largely plant-based diet built around whole plant foods, very limited amounts of meat, very low in fat, no dairy, you have very low rates of prediabetes, and diabetes itself is almost non-existent. But you look at Blacks living in the United States and Great Britain who are eating a Western style diet, and these diseases or these problems are off the chart. They're sky high. And so that shows you that it's the diet that's causing the problem, because the whole point of comparing Blacks in Britain and US to Blacks in West Africa is that they're sharing the same gene pool, because that's where the slaves were taken from, West Africa. So you've got the same genetic background, but when you're eating different types of food, one creates disease, one does not. And so-called soul food is peculiar to the African-American community. It typically includes things like chitlins, oxtails, neck bones, pig's feet, and other high-fat, high-salt, and sugar-laden unhealthy foods. And, some people say, well, I eat macaroni and cheese because it's pasta. That's still a high-fat food, depending on how it's made. But this is not soul food, it is plantation food. West Africans brought to America were forced to eat the literal garbage of the slave labor camps called plantations that they were imprisoned on. And that's why they were given the entrails and the feet and the tails and the ears and so forth. And, God bless them. They showed ingenuity and resolve and did their best to transform that refuse that they were given into acceptable food. That's also a reason that African Americans tend to use a lot of seasoning in our food, because much of the food the slaves were given was rotting. And so to cover up that rotten food or rotten taste, and to make the food palatable, they learned to season it very heavily. The problem is that, unfortunately, after African Americans were freed, we ended up claiming this dietary vestige of slavery, christening it soul food, and carrying it with us. And the fact is that these foods are not soul food. They are health-destroying plantation food. They are not our true heritage, and we need to reject this vestige of slavery and return to our true dietary heritage, which is a plant-based diet that promotes health. Now let's talk about what I call the normative post-colonization diet. Most versions of ethnic cuisines that we see in Western countries are really post-colonization versions of these cuisines. These are not the types of diets that these ethnic groups were eating prior to being colonized by European countries. So because they are very heavily based around meat and other animal foods. But when you look at really traditional Thai diets or traditional Chinese, Mexican American, and South Asian diets, those traditional diets actually contained very small portions, if any, of animal foods. Certainly Chinese, Thai, and even Hispanic or New World Hispanic diets did not contain dairy prior to being colonized by Spain and other European countries. But again, once the Europeans came in, they brought in the use of dairy and wanted a lot more animal food in the diet. And so suddenly meat became the center of the meal instead of the plant foods. So these post-colonization style ethnic diets feature large quantities of meat and other animal foods, and they contain dairy, which again, were not traditional parts of these diets. Traditional ethnic cuisines were typically low-fat, plant-based diets built around whole grains, legumes, vegetables, and contain limited amounts of animal proteins. And if you ever have the opportunity, once we get through this COVID pandemic, to visit the Native American Museum in Washington, D.C., which I wholeheartedly encourage you to do. It's a magnificent museum. One of the main exhibits is what they call the Three Sisters, which is pointing out that traditional Native American diets were built around the planting of corn, beans, and squash. And those were the staples for Native Americans, not hunting buffalo, as is so often depicted in Hollywood movies. But an equally destructive error is what I call metaphorically attempting to move from slave quarters to the big house. So in other words, instead of eating, say soul food or what's considered poor man's food, many people of color attempt to emulate the behaviors and dietary practices they perceive to be reflective of the so-called good life. So they may not eat chitlins, but they want to eat steak and shrimp and so forth. And so they begin consuming this meat-heavy diet of beef, seafood, poultry, cheese, and other coveted items to show that they have made it and are accepted in their new society. And we see this very often in Asians moving from Asia to the United States. And so you look and you do these migration studies on Asian women, and you see that as they move from Japan to, say, Hawaii, where they adopt a diet halfway in between Hawaii and the Japan and the US mainland, and then eventually move to the mainland where they adopt a fully Americanized diet, their incidence of breast cancer goes, in Hawaii, it's halfway between Japan and the US. By the time they get to the United States and adopt a fully Americanized diet, not only does their incidence of breast cancer rise to the national average, it actually exceeds it to some extent. And Asian women are actually the group with the fastest growing rate of breast cancer, and they tend to get it at earlier ages and lower body weights than other ethnic groups. Same thing is true of diabetes, that Asians, people of Asian ethnicity who eat an American style diet tend to get diabetes at lower body weights than other ethnic groups. Just again, underscoring how unhealthy assimilating to this Western style, meat heavy, processed carb heavy diet is for us. Again, this diet is as unhealthy and disease promoting as diets that are contain the less expensive fast and junk foods. And another danger that is associated with these aspirational mindset is that we are exporting this destructive and environmentally devastating type of lifestyle and eating around the world, and it is having a tremendously detrimental impact on our planet and its climate. And these are 3 books I would encourage everyone to check out. One is Beyond Beef by Jeremy Rifkin, where he explores the incredibly destructive effects raising beef for human consumption has on world ecology, and the things that he points out about beef are also true of pork, poultry production as well. And water follies, Robert Glennon talks about the overuse of freshwater resources for agricultural purposes and how we are quickly exhausting our freshwater resources and are literally running out of water. And the fact is that if we were not eating animals and growing food to feed the animals, we would not be using, we could use less than half of the amount of water that we use in a given year. And then finally, in the empty ocean, Richard Ellis shows that the current ways that we are fishing the oceans are non-sustainable, and that we are literally going to turn the oceans into a desert within the next 50 to 60 years. So studies have shown that racism literally shortens the lives and hurts the health of Blacks and Hispanics and other people of color by promoting the expression of genes that will increase inflammation and illness. This has literally been shown, documented scientifically. And it turns out that the concept of race, while it is generally accepted, is really entirely bogus and has no biological basis. Race was invented by European academics first to describe and then to justify their maltreatment of non-European ethnic groups. So when you look at the United States, Thomas Jefferson wrote this, soaring elegiac Declaration of Independence, talking about the inherent rights of human beings to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and how God loved people and we all deserve to be treated fairly. Well, how do you reconcile that with owning slaves? The way you reconcile it is by saying that the people you enslave are really not fully human, that they are biologically inferior, and that is why it is acceptable to treat them this way. And that is why the whole concept of race was invented, so that they could justify what they were doing. But the current studies that now that we've actually sequenced the human genome, we know that the differences that account for the physical differences in the so-called races literally are minuscule. Less than 0.1% of our genes account for the fact that I have dark skin versus the fact that Tom has white skin, the fact that his hair is straight and mine is kinky. That these physical differences are literally meaningless. That we are literally all the same race. And so this idea we have in our head is something that we've invented, and it's a figment of our imagination. But it has created this hideous phenomenon of racism, which is associated with chronic low-grade inflammation, leading to elevations in stress hormones that actually exacerbate a number of diseases. Stress induced by racism has literally been shown, again, in studies, to shorten the telomeres at the end of our chromosomes, which decrease lifespan and increase our risk for chronic diseases. Racism-induced stress alters brain chemistry and both brain structure and brain chemistry, and that has been shown to start in utero. They've done studies on Hispanic women who have been subjected to racial stress coming across the border and working in these racially stressful situations, and have shown that it's had an impact on their babies if they were pregnant. Pregnant women experiencing racial stress have a much higher risk for both premature birth and having low birth weight babies, who will then go on to have a bunch of health risks throughout their life. A lifetime of racism and discrimination can lead sufferers to have more chronic diseases and shorten lifespan. So people of color forced to live with American racism essentially are living with chronic PTSD. So let's talk about epigenetics. And this cover is from a Time magazine story that appeared in January 2010. And I like it because it sort of encapsulates the whole idea of why epigenetics is so important because it used to be thought a generation ago that your DNA was set in stone, that the DNA bequeathed to you by your parents, those genes determined not only what you looked like, how tall you were, but also what your health risks were as you lived your life. Well, we now know that that's not true. That in fact, the food, not only that you eat, but the food that your great grandparents ate determines your risk because it modifies your DNA in ways that can be passed down to you through 3 or 4 generations has been documented in human beings. So epigenetics literally means above the genome and shows how diet and environment can affect and change our DNA. With the recent and belated recognition that the long stretches of DNA that they used to think of as so-called junk DNA are actually the regulatory sections of the DNA. So when they were first sequencing the human genome, what they found was that most of the DNA or the area on our chromosomes didn't code for actual genes. That they could isolate genes that made proteins, but most of the DNA didn't make any proteins. And so for years, scientists thought, well, that was just junk DNA. It was DNA left over from, so-called evolution that our bodies hadn't gotten rid of. It was only later that they came to understand that those sequences actually regulated how the genes were turned on and turned off and whether they would be turned on and turned off. And so it became, and since we have much more regulatory DNA than we have active active genes, it became very clear that the control of those regulatory sections of DNA had a much more profound, pervasive, and persistent role in our lives and health than we ever could have suspected. Regulatory genes actually outnumber functional genes by a ratio of 50-1. So it turns out diet controls our DNA. I cannot, it's like if I could come to every person attending this lecture's house and literally scream in your ear with a bullhorn, that's how important it is for you to get this concept. That the food that you eat will modify your DNA in a way that will literally decide whether good genes are turned on and bad genes are turned off, or the reverse will happen. But even more importantly, if you are of childbearing age, you will pass that tendency down 2 or 3 generations. And I'm just going to take a little minute here and have a religious moment, because if you remember in the 10 Commandments, where God says that, I believe it's the second commandment where he tells us not to have graven images. There's a passage where he says that he visits the iniquity of the fathers out to the 3rd and 4th generations of them that hate him. Epigenetics explains that if you don't do what God asks you to do, that you can literally pass those bad effects down 2 and 3 generations, and maybe even 4. So what is epigenetics? All DNA is actually coded and protected by what are called histone proteins. Well, these histone proteins can be modified by a process called methylation, where they get these methyl groups attached to them, or acetylation, where they get acetyl groups attached to them. And a methyl group is a 1 carbon group, and acetylation are 2 carbon groups that can be attached to these histone proteins by consuming plant foods. And whether or not these histone proteins have the methyl and acetyl groups attached to them, then changes the rates at which the genes downstream from them are transcribed. And so what studies have shown is that when you have a high rate of methylation and acetylation from a plant food heavy diet, it turns off cancer causing genes and turns on tumor suppressor genes. But when your DNA loses those acetyl and methyl groups, that does the exact opposite. It makes it much more likely that the cancer causing genes will turn on and the tumor suppressor genes will become quiet and lose their effectiveness. So these epigenetic effects are literally analogous to software versus hardware. Your DNA is the hardware, but your diet is the software that programs that hardware. And these influences actually in lower animals have been shown to persist across 13 to 40 generations in flatworms, but they have been documented out to 3 and 4 generations in human beings. Documented. The epigenetics of cancer is very well studied in cancer cells. Many genes lose their normal methyl attachments, and that's what causes them to become functional. There was a study published in the British Journal of Nutrition in 2009 that showed diet-induced changes in the epigenetic regulation of a gene called human mitochondrial superoxide dismutase, which is very important for killing off bacteria and cancer cells and so forth. And Dean Ornish, who's very famous for showing the reversal of heart disease with the plant-based diet, published a study in Lancet Oncology Journal, in 2008 that showed, and this is super important, increased telomerase activity after only 3 months on a plant-based diet. Well, what's telomerase? Telomerase is the enzymes that make your telomeres longer. And remember, I said the longer your telomeres are, the longer you live and the more resistant you are to disease. So again, eating a plant-based diet will make that enzymes that keeps those telomeres long more active. So, when we think about addiction, everybody wants to talk about alcoholics and drug addicts, but the fact is that the largest, most destructive epidemic of addiction that we see in the United States is not caused by drugs and alcohol. It's really due to our addiction to unhealthy foods. The devastating impact of this national eating disorder is reflected in the spiraling rates of diabetes, obesity, cancer, depression, and other chronic diseases that we see. It is estimated that the number of Americans diagnosed with diabetes, for instance, has increased by more than 80% over the last 15 to 20 years alone. This avalanche of diabetes and chronic disease has affected people of all races, of course, and it's been fueled by the corruption and homogenization of American eating habits by giant fast and snack food corporations. And at the top, you see a picture of a gas station. Why? Because when I was a kid, you went to the gas station to get gas. Now you can go to the gas station and get gas, but you can also get a hot dog that's older than you are. You can get sushi. You can get, all kinds of garbage you should never eat at all, but least of all from a gas station. You cannot get in Walmart without fighting your way past McDonald's. And then we stuff our kids full of so many Happy Meals, they look like little Michelin men. And we've seen the proliferation of fast food restaurants in poor neighborhoods. They put these unhealthy foods within easy reach of everybody, and then couple this with marketing campaigns that encourage people to overindulge in these unhealthy foods just on a whim. and the damaging and destructive effects of these chronic diseases are amplified in communities of color and among racial and ethnic minorities because the diseases reach disproportionate levels and cause complications and premature death rates that are well above the national average. So for instance, African Americans diagnosed with diabetes, according to data taken from the Kaiser Institute, are 240 times more likely to end up with limb amputations and over 100 times more likely to end up with kidney failure, leading to dialysis or retinal damage that leads to blindness. And this, of course, then has a correspondingly devastating economic impact on the community because, excuse me, these diseases frequently affect the primary wage earner in the home, or they consume so much of the family's money and resources that there simply isn't enough income left over to, help the family move to a better neighborhood, get a better house, get the kids in better schools, and so forth. And so it just keeps the family mired in a cycle of poverty and ill health. Well, the fact is that the book of Genesis tells us that God literally designed humans to be exclusively plant eaters, Genesis 1:21. Book of Daniel tells us that if we eat a plant-based diet, we'll be healthier and happier and more mentally astute than if we consume a diet that is rich in animal foods. Modern research confirms all of this. It shows that our plant-based diets are healthier because they promote better mental and physical health. They also decrease chronic diseases and help us live longer and more active and fully functional lives. The Adventist health studies show that vegetarian men who will live an average of 9.5 years longer, and vegetarian women live about 6.6 years longer on average than people who eat meat. And the only reason the women don't live on average as long as the men is because, ladies, you guys already outlive us by so much that there just isn't as much room for improvement. This study also showed that vegetarians have less cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and hypertension, and also have a lower risk of all-cause mortality than meat eaters. So that means we're even less likely to jump off a building than people who eat meat. And I wanted to show this because, again, this shows how changing one's diet affects your disease patterns and risk of death on a population basis. So you see the first bar graph is data from 1880, and then the next bar graph is data from 1997. Now, these are stats showing the causes of death in England and Wales from comparing 1880 to 1987. And you might say, well, wait a minute, why aren't you showing me the United States? Turns out, apparently back in 1880, we were not keeping good public health statistics. So I had to go to a much older country where they were keeping good statistics, but our diets were roughly the same. But the important point is that back in 1880, what was true in England was also true in the United States. And that is that the majority of the population could not afford to eat meat. Nobody had a refrigerator. Growing animals to consume them was a very expensive process. And so people were by default primarily plant-based. And they only ate meat on special occasions. The only people who could afford to eat meat on a regular basis were the wealthy and royalty, which is why gout used to be the disease of kings, because only they ate enough meat to actually get gout. Everybody else was eating basically plant foods. And so what did people die from? Mainly in 1880, it was infectious types diseases and accidents. But you can see that cancers were almost non-existent. Diseases of the circulatory system, like heart disease and strokes, again, almost non-existent. But there was a lot of TB and diseases related to the inhalation of coal dust. So you see respiratory diseases were fairly prominent. That's the green. Infectious and parasitic diseases in red. Again, cholera, other communicable diseases. And then where it says other diseases, that would include, accidents or just odd things like congenital problems that they didn't have surgical procedures for. Also, a lot of women died in childbirth because doctors didn't realize they needed to wash their hands before they examined the patient and so forth. Frame shift to 1997, completely different. Everybody's eating meat, eating at McDonald's, chowing down on all this animal food. Suddenly, cancer and heart disease is killing everybody. We've now cleaned up our act with respect to cleaning the air, getting rid of we have treatments for TB. We've given people vaccines and stuff for a lot of the infectious diseases. Those account for a much smaller percentage of the death we see, but most of what's happening to people now is related to the foods that we're eating. So clearly the food that we eat matters. Plant-based diets have been shown through more than 100 years of research to reduce and prevent chronic diseases, including dementias, and they also increase longevity. There are very specific reasons why plant-based diets are so effective in keeping humans healthy and disease-free. This chart comes by way of my friend Brenda Davis, who is a wonderful research dietitian, and I'm using this with her permission. But what this slide points out beautifully is that the protective factors in plant-based diets are the fiber, phytochemicals, plant enzymes, antioxidants, anti-inflammatory compounds, plant sterols and stanols, pre and probiotics, the macronutrients from healthy sources, and micronutrients from healthy sources. So with these lectures, we will explore how these factors work in the lectures that follow. So what is in the food that we eat? So let's just take a look at protein sources. So we're looking here at pumpkin seeds per 100 grams versus steak, which, many people have the erroneous belief that in order to get protein, you have to consume animal food or animal tissue. And I don't have time to go into just why that is such a misconception. But what I will encourage everyone listening to this lecture to do is to go to YouTube and look up my lecture, Nutrition, Chemistry for Understanding Nutrition, Protein, that explains all of this, that all protein is made by plants. Any protein you get from an animal source is recycled plant protein, but not only does it come recycled, it comes with a bunch of junk that you don't need. But even the plant sources are better for you from the get-go. So you look at 100 grams of pumpkin seeds versus 100 grams of steak, you get more protein in the pumpkin seeds, you get more iron and more zinc. So number one, you're starting off ahead with the plants, but then let's look at what you do get and what you don't get. So on the left here, you see from this company called Huel, they made a vegan chili. And they point out the fact that you get 24 grams of plant-based protein, it's perfectly balanced, and you get all of your essential vitamins and minerals. You compare that with this garbage Popeye's chicken sandwich that everybody's screaming about. And what do you get in that? Yeah, you get a bunch of animal protein, some processed carbs, but the animal protein causes cancer. It's full of heme iron. Because of the way it's cooked, it has cancer-causing heterocyclic amines and polycyclic amines. It's loaded with animal fat, much of which is saturated. And once you absorb that animal protein and it passes into your colon, it promotes the formation of trimethylamine oxide, TMAO, which again, in and of itself, will promote the development of cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. So this is just a giant wad of disease-causing garbage that doesn't deliver anything beneficial to your body, okay? Contrast that with the vegan chili. All 27 essential vitamins and minerals, in addition, gives you both soluble and insoluble fiber, a bunch of phytochemicals, phytates, which are known to suppress the development of cancer, turn on disease-fighting disease, has detoxifying enzymes, loaded with antioxidants, and has anti-cancer, anti-heart disease, anti-diabetes compounds in it. This is why plant foods promote health. Animal foods will kill you. So let's now focus on heart disease. Tom, can you hear me? Do me a favor. Turn on your microphone and tell me, how long have I been talking so far?
You've been talking about 55 minutes. Okay,
cool. All right. Because I just realized that the battery died on my watch. All right. I will, do me a favor. After I've gone another 15 minutes, or after I've gone another 10 minutes, hold up your hand, give me the 5-minute signal, and then I'll wind down tonight. We'll do the questions, and then we'll finish up with the lecture tomorrow for all the other topics. Okay? All right, cool. So what is a heart attack? Again, does that mean that your heart's going to somehow put on boxing gloves and start to beat you up? No. Let's talk about what that actually is. The coronary arteries are the blood vessels that supply blood to the heart. And they were called coronary, which means crowns, because if you kind of flip this picture in your mind upside down, they surround the heart like a crown, or at least the early anatomists thought so. And a heart attack occurs when one or more of these arteries becomes completely blocked and thereby deprives the portion of the heart muscle that it's supposed to supply of its blood supply. And if that's not reversed, that portion of heart muscle will die. Now, let's talk about what your heart does for you every day. Every day, if you're just kind of sitting around working on your computer, watching TV, or not doing very much, your heart still beats at least 100,000 times. Okay, and a gallon of blood probably weighs between 8 or 9 pounds. And so that means that your heart is pumping over 2,000 gallons of blood. And I can't even tell, I mean, you can calculate how much weight it's lifting and moving every single day. Your heart is phenomenal in terms of what it's doing for you every single day to keep you alive. And since our heart is so good to us, we need to learn how to be good to it. So I want you to watch this little video here. This is normal blood flow through your blood vessels before you eat a meal. You see how nice and smoothly those red blood cells are flowing through your capillaries? Just jamming along, delivering oxygen and nutrients to your cells. But then watch what happens once you eat a high-fat meal. You see how sludgy that is? How clogged up they are? How slowly they're moving? That's why clots start to form. That's why you can't get oxygen to your brain. That's why you start to feel sluggish and sleepy and tired after you eat a big, greasy, nasty, garbage meal. Because this is what you're doing to yourself. And it can take up to 10 hours before a flow will return to normal. But the problem is, while that blood is full of grease and is sludgy, like I said, it is more likely to form a clot, which means that it can actually initiate a heart attack, or if it's in the brain, can initiate a stroke. So you may not make it to that 10-hour window where your blood flow returns to normal. You may be dead before that 10 hours is up, which is why you can't play Russian roulette with your health. So again, heart attacks are not sudden events. They take years to develop. First step in this process is an injury to a pristine artery. So this is what your artery looks like with normal epithelium. The first part of that process is you get an injury to the lining of that artery, and over time, cholesterol and fat from that sludging gets deposited at the site of that injury, and you get the buildup of a plaque. And that plaque, as you can see, is starting to close off the lumen of that artery. And as the plaque enlarges, it gradually reduces the area through which blood can flow, and it can become very, very narrow. And so instead of having a wide open artery, you literally end up with something that looks like this. Blood that has to flow across that blockage has to speed up, just like when you put your thumb across the opening of a water hose. But as it speeds up, it creates what are called shear forces, which means that it can peel off that layer of endothelium at the top. And once that happens, it's just like if you peel a layer of skin off your arm, your body considers that an injury and a sore, and it's going to form a clot there. Well, if you form a clot at that place where there's a narrowing, you will stop all blood flow distal to that blockage. And this is going to show you the similar thing in a different way. So again, we see at this area here, we get the buildup of the plaque. And if once this process gets started and blood flow is impeded, if it's a slow enough process, you can get what's called angina. So that when you're stressed or you have to run up the stairs, you start doing work and your heart can't get enough blood, it starts to make you feel this tightness or this shortness of breath or this heaviness in your chest. That's the angina. But over time, as that plaque gets larger and larger and the blood flow gets more significant, you can finally get to a point where, as I said, that clot ruptures, you get a blood, or that plaque ruptures, you get a blood clot that forms at that site. And once that blood clot is there, everything distal to that clot is no longer getting blood. And you know that if you deprive tissue of blood, what happens? That tissue will die. That's why you have essentially, well, they say 6 hours to restore blood flow to the heart to try and save as much tissue as possible. Clearly, in the hospital, we say you got a golden hour. We want to get that blood flow restored as soon as possible, because the process of cell death really starts pretty much after about 30 minutes or so. And the longer the heart muscle is deprived of blood flow, the more cells will die. And pretty much if a portion of the heart, if that blood flow is not restored within 4 to 6 hours, that portion of the heart muscle that is deprived of the blood flow will be dead, and you'll form scar at that area, and the heart will not be able to function as effectively from that point forward. And that's also why aspirin is one of the first things they give you when you are showing signs of a heart attack, because aspirin interferes with the function of platelets. Platelets are those sticky little blood cells that help clots to form. Well, again, remember I told you, the clot formation is generally the terminal or the last step in the formation of that closure to the artery. So by giving someone an aspirin, you can help dissolve that clot and restore blood flow. But I want you to understand, let's say someone has crushing chest pain, shortness of breath. You make them chew up and swallow an aspirin, and then 30 minutes later, they're feeling better. That pain is subsiding. Is their heart disease gone? I want to see y'all's heads. Shake yes or no. No, that blockage is still there. And that is what is key. That's why I hate to hear people say aspirin treats heart disease. No, it doesn't. Aspirin can prevent the last step in a heart attack, but it don't treat nothing. The heart disease is caused by the grease and cholesterol people are eating. The only thing that's going to treat that is to change your diet. All right. So again, clot dissolving drugs, angioplasty, stents, coronary artery bypass, all interventions designed to restore blood flow to an at-risk heart muscle. But epidemiology studies show that populations consuming plant-based diets are at much lower risk for developing heart disease, because healthy plant-based diets benefit the heart by being low in total and saturated fat, but high in heart healthy fats like mono and polyunsaturated oils, which come from plants, These diets are also high in fiber, plant proteins, and antioxidants, and contain little or no cholesterol if you're vegan. Vegetarians and vegans typically have cardiovascular risk profiles that are well below those of people eating meat. They usually live longer, have lower weight, lower blood pressure, lower levels of something called homocysteine, which can damage blood vessels, and have cholesterol levels that can be 100 to 150 points below those of people who eat meat. And again, this is from the first Adventist health study, and it showed that for every age they looked at within that group, the Seventh-day Adventists had much lower incidence of heart disease. Now, I just want to point out that this just looked at all Adventists compared to non-Adventists. So that included the Adventists who were plant-based, but also the ones who were not plant-based. If they had only looked at the plant-based Adventists, there would have been an even greater difference. Okay, so but just keep that in mind. All right, so watch this video.
The heart has two sides, a right side and a left side, and four chambers: the top receiving chambers, or atrium, and the lower chambers, which are thick-walled pumping chambers called ventricles. Red blood cell will come from either the superior vena cava or the inferior vena cava and enter into the right atrium. The blood then flows across the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle. The right ventricle then squeezes and ejects that blood cell into a vessel called the pulmonary artery. Pulmonary artery splits into two vessels, each going to the lungs. As that red blood cell makes its way through the lung, it returns through the pulmonary veins to the left atrium. That blood is now oxygenated. It's picked up oxygen, then goes across the mitral valve into the left ventricle, which does most of the work in terms of delivery of blood flow to the body. That blood cell is now ejected into the aorta to some organ or muscle or skin in the human body.
Okay, I know that was a little quick, but I hope you all got the gist of that. So the right side of the heart receives blood from the venous system, blood that has coming from the body that has depleted of oxygen, but that is loaded with carbon dioxide. It then sends that blood to the lungs, where the carbon dioxide is exhaled, given up, oxygen is taken on. It returns to the heart on the left side, where it's delivered to the left ventricle, which then pumps it out to the whole body through the aorta. Okay, I see you, Tom. What's important to know is that the left ventricle accounts for about 70% of the total weight of the heart. So it's doing most of the work of your heart, okay? And the purposes of the valves in the heart is to prevent backflow so that the flow through the heart goes in only one way, in the way that it should. So let's talk about the phenomenon of heart failure, because plant-based diets have been shown to cut heart failure risk by 40%. So on the left here, you see a normal heart, and on the right, you see what's called congestive heart failure. Congestive heart failure occurs when the heart becomes weakened, gets enlarged, becomes like a big floppy bag, and cannot pump effectively. And when that happens, you start to get fluid backing up in your legs, but it also backs up in the lungs, and people get short of breath. They have low exercise tolerance because the heart simply can't supply oxygen and blood to the exercising body. The CHF occurs when the heart becomes so weakened and enlarged it no longer pumps blood effectively. It can be caused by a number of things, such as long-standing coronary artery disease that slowly causes the heart muscle to be damaged because it's not getting enough oxygen over time. When people have multiple heart attacks that causes portions of the heart muscle to die, you end up with a heart that is deeply scarred, and then because it can't pump effectively, it starts to stretch out and dilate and becomes an ineffective pump. If you have long-standing untreated high blood pressure, initially what will happen is that will cause the heart muscle to get real thick, and you have what's called left ventricular hypertrophy. And like any muscle, if the heart is forced to work harder, it gets bigger. So if your blood pressure is very high, it forces the heart to pump against that higher pressure. It's like forcing your biceps to lift a heavier weight. The heart muscle will get thick, but it then becomes harder to supply that thicker muscle with oxygen and nutrients. And over time, again, you'll get scar tissue forming in the heart, and eventually the heart wears out and it starts to weaken and stretch out and becomes, you get congestive heart failure. So that's another reason why it's so important to control your blood pressure and make sure you have good blood pressure control. And then you can also get congestive heart failure from certain types of valvular disease. So if you get something called aortic stenosis, where the aortic valve becomes really calcified and won't open properly, then the heart, again, can't pump against that narrow valve and it can stretch out. Or if it becomes what's called incompetent, and all of that gets probably more detailed than we need to be in this lecture, but just know that valvular problems can cause CHF as well. But good news is studies have shown that people who have CHF and very low ejection fraction. So just what is an ejection fraction? So when the normal heart fills up with blood, and we'll say when the left ventricle is full, when during the relaxation phase, which is called diastole, and it's ready to then squeeze blood out to your body, it probably has about 100 mLs of blood in it. And then it pumps and then it relaxes. Well, when it squeezes, a normal ejection fraction is 60% of the blood that's in the chamber will be squeezed out to your body. But when you get to congestive heart failure, your ejection fraction starts to fall, and it can go down to 40%, 30%. By the time it gets down to 20%, a person with an EF of 15 to 20% will basically be able to get up and walk from their chair to the bathroom, and that's about it before they are severely short of breath. Your life will be severely limited by that point. But the amazing news is there's several doctors, one of whom most notably is Dr. Baxter Montgomery in Houston, Texas, who has a vegan restaurant attached to his clinic and uses a vegan diet to treat all manner of heart disease. He has shown people recover as much as 20% of their ejection fraction once they are put on a plant-based diet, even with congestive failure, which is really revolutionary. So again, not only can plant-based diets reduce the risk of developing CHF in the first place, they have been shown to reverse it. And then I'm going to talk about valvular disease a little bit here, and then we'll stop here today and finish up tomorrow. There's just so much to cover, folks, but we'll do our best to get through everything tomorrow. So again, valvular disease can affect any of the valves in the heart. The most common forms of valvular disease that we see typically affect the aortic valve, which is that Tricuspid valve at the top of this picture, or the mitral valve, which is the one on the right side of this picture. The valve on the left side is what's called the tricuspid valve, and that typically, when you see problems with that, those are most often congenital problems, meaning there was a baby was born with a problem with that valve, and it's usually picked up in infancy and very often can be fixed by surgery. But people who use IV drugs can frequently seed their bloodstream with bacteria that can then attach itself to either the aortic or mitral valve, and then as the bacteria multiply, they actually eat up and destroy the valves. And then they can, those individuals will have to get those valves replaced. Again, certain types of lifestyle factors and diets can promote the development of aortic stenosis or mitral valve problems that, again, may require valve replacements. And obviously, we want to try to avoid the need for valve replacement, because the amazing thing about your heart is that your heart completely remakes itself about every 21 days. Again, I told you how hard your heart is working. Well, your heart cells are completely replacing themselves. They replace all of their contractile proteins. They're doing this in a continual fashion. And about every 21 days, your heart has completely remade itself. And it's the same thing with the valves. They have to, otherwise they'd wear out. Well, when we put in a mechanical valve, or if they put in a valve from, say, a pig or some other, well, they usually use what they call porcine or pig valve, those valves don't get replaced, and they will eventually wear out. And so they will, people, depending on how old they are when they get a valve replacement, they will eventually need to get it redone again, which again can be is generally major surgery. And so depending on how old the person is, they'll decide whether or not to put in a pig valve versus a mechanical valve. What's the difference? Typically, if you put in a pig valve, you don't have to put people on blood thinners. If you put in a mechanical valve, which has a longer life because it's metal, the problem is you put blood on metal, what happens? The blood starts to clot. So people on with metal valves have to take blood thinners, and that creates a whole nother set of problems with the risk of bleeding issues. So, and that brings up, and we talked about congenital aortic stenosis and aortic insufficiency can lead to CHF if not treated, because again, if the aortic valve, which is that three-cusp valve, doesn't open, it causes blood to back up in the left ventricle, which will eventually cause it to dilate. But mitral stenosis or incompetency can lead to atrial fibrillation, and so can congestive heart failure. And atrial fibrillation is a common problem we're seeing, and a lot of people are have the question of, well, can I treat atrial fibrillation with a plant-based diet? So there's several considerations. The shorter period of time that someone has been in atrial fibrillation, the better chance they have of reversing it. Okay, so I want to make that clear. So if someone is newly diagnosed with atrial fibrillation, then they have a better chance of being able to reverse it. And again, Dr. Montgomery, who is a cardiologist, has shown some effectiveness with helping to treat atrial fibrillation with a plant-based diet. And I would refer all questions in that regard to him. Dr. Kim Williams in Chicago may also have experience in that area as well. The big issue for people diagnosed with atrial fibrillation is they are all told they have to take blood thinners. And people wonder, well, why do I have to take these one, medications for the rest of my life? Two, why do I have to be on blood thinners? Because they all have risks of, you know, if I fall or bump into something, or you know, they could end up causing me to have a stroke. Why do I have to take blood thinners? Well, the reason is that if you think back to that video on how the heart pumps, and God, I wish I had a pointer, but sadly I don't. I want you guys to look at this picture of the heart, and you see right in the middle, you see this little bump with two cords or fibers coming down out of it, wrapping down around the bottom of the heart and then flowing back up through the sides of the heart. Everybody see that, right? Okay, that is the conduction system in the heart. And what happens is there is a pacemaker in the atria, the top part of the heart, that sends a signal out that tells the atria to contract. Those are the two top chambers. Those atria contract, squeeze blood into the ventricles, which are the large chambers, and then that signal hits that little bump or node, and the conduction then travels down to the bottom of the ventricles, then spreads upwards, so that when the ventricles contract, they contract from the bottom up. And actually, if I had another picture, I could show you that the fibers in the heart really follow a spiral pattern. So the heart literally wrings itself out when it contracts. It's actually, I tell you, it's beautiful to see. But the point is that the atria normally contract in a coordinated fashion. They squeeze and then relax, squeeze and relax. What happens in atrial fibrillation is that coordinated contraction becomes disorganized. The cells no longer contract together, and they just start contracting independently. And so instead of giving you a nice squeezing, it just sits there and vibrates. Okay? Well, when that happens, that means that blood starts to pool in the outer areas of the atria. Now, blood is still moving through the heart just by force of volume, but some of it is pooling in areas in the atria. And if it stays there long enough, it can form clots. And then occasionally, a piece of those clots might break off and go into the ventricle. And if it goes into the left ventricle, it can get ejected out into the body, and most often it goes up into the brain and can cause a stroke. And so that is why they want to put people with atrial fibrillation, if they can't reestablish coordinated contraction, they want to put them on blood thinners to reduce the risk of them having a stroke. So again, AF or atrial fibrillation occurs when atria become dilated, stop contracting, coordinated manner, vibrate, blood pools, and forms these clots, which are called strokes. And that's why you need to be on blood thinners. And I do not know of a good or reliable, I'm not sure why that line is there, plant-based alternative to blood thinners. So we're going to stop here, and we'll pick up tomorrow with hypertension. And tomorrow we'll cover hypertension, diabetes, COVID and immune function, and autoimmune diseases. And we'll do an overview of women's health. But it's only going to be an overview because I really think that to do justice to the issues surrounding women's health, you need a program specifically addressing those issues by someone who is expert in issues of women's health. And then we'll touch on what's wrong with dairy. So with that, give me a minute, and I'm going to. And we'll also talk about depression and dementia. I'm going to skip to the end here.
So, Dr. Mills, I had a question regarding.
No, I'm gonna take questions. I just want to finish up with a couple of slides. This is my prescription for your health, and I have a suggested reading list. Okay.
Wow.
And then the reason we need question and answer sessions is because oftentimes we say something, but people hear something else entirely, and that's illustrated by this cartoon. He says, Lassie, get help. And she went to the psychiatrist instead of bringing somebody to pull him out the river. So with that, I will take questions.
Okay, I wanted to get clarification on tomatoes, tomato juice, oranges and orange juice, and apple juice. Is that good or harmful to any organs in the body?
Okay, so harmful. The short answer is no, depending on how much you drink and on your personal constitution. So what do I mean by that? An apple has not only the juice in it, but also fiber. And when you juice an apple, like, you know, you can get apple juice that's really cloudy, and you can get the clarified apple juice, right? So the apple juice that's cloudy does still have some of the fibrous components of the apple in it. Whereas the apple juice that's really clear and clarified has had all of the fiber removed and just has kind of the juice and the sugar. It's still a fairly healthy product, but it is now kind of a concentrated form of sugar. So in that sense, you do want to limit the amount that you drink, because it you can eat, if you just sat down and ate like you know, 2 or 3 apples, you still wouldn't get the amount of juice you would get, say, in a 12-ounce serving of apple juice. You feel me?
Yeah.
So
tomatoes kind of acidy.
So you know, that's a good question, because that depends on a person's makeup. Because some people find that tomatoes cause them a lot of acid production. Tomatoes don't cause a problem for me. Tomatoes are actually filled with lycopene. They're very good for our eyes, for our prostate, and other problems. But some people can't tolerate them. Onions. Onions are an allium vegetable that have been shown to be incredibly helpful and protective against a variety of diseases. If my mother eats an onion, she'll be burpy and gassy for the rest of the evening. So she avoids them unless they've been thoroughly cooked. I love raw onions and everything. So, you know, each of us has a slightly different constitution, and it may be that one type of vegetable doesn't agree with a particular person, but that doesn't mean that that vegetable is bad. So there's nothing inherently wrong with tomatoes. But if you find that they do upset your constitution, then I would say just limit your exposure to them. But in and of themselves, no, they are not unhealthy. And in fact, there are many, many helpful components to them. But in general, when it comes to plant foods, it's better to it's healthier to always eat the whole intact plant than to, you know, process it, you know, down to just the juice or something like that. And if you do that, just make sure that you limit the amount you eat in that juiced form. Well, you know, let me modify even that statement. I think we have to limit our intake of fruit juices. Vegetable juices can be very beneficial, and there's not a lot of sugar in them, so that you have to be less worried about.
Evelyn Warren has her hand up. Go ahead, Evelyn.
Hi, Dr. Mills.
Hello.
Hey, good to see you again.
You too.
You mentioned an expert in Houston, an expert.
Baxter Montgomery. Dr. Baxter Montgomery.
And he's the one, the expert on AFib, correct?
He's a cardiologist. So Baxter is a phenomenal cardiologist. He's expert. If I had any family member or I myself develop any problem with my heart, he's the one I'd go see.
Okay, because my husband developed AFib after having colon cancer, and with the treatment of chemotherapy.
Yeah, that can cause those problems. Yeah.
And so he has developed AFib from that. And so it would be really good to see an expert that could
That's
really
plant-based.
address that.
Yeah, that is the man. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
And tell him I referred you.
Okay, I will.
All right.
Any more questions? Now, somebody needs to ask a question or otherwise I will. Oh, okay, Star, go ahead.
I think Star's still muted.
No, she just unmuted herself.
Oh.
Muting and unmuting and muting again. So,
Okay.
okay. So I'm getting a little confused when you talk about the oxygen going into the heart and you're showing the vessels in the blood. Where does that oxygen come from? Is it within the blood itself?
Sure. So again, the heart is really two separate pumps. There's the right side and the left side. So the right side receives oxygen depleted blood from the body. And the right ventricle then sends that blood into the lungs. And in the lungs is where the carbon dioxide is released and oxygen is picked up. And then that oxygenated blood returns to the heart into the left atrium, which squeezes it into the left ventricle. Then the left ventricle pumps it out to the body through the arteries. Does that make it clear?
Yes, much clearer. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Where is this oxygen coming from? Okay.
Yeah, it's from the lungs. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
I have a question.
Steve,
Do certain vegetables exacerbate arthritis?
That's a very good question, because I have a friend, longtime vegan, who absolutely will not eat vegetables that are in the nightshade family. And you know, nightshades as a group are cover a lot of different plant foods, but Amy swears that if she eats something from the nightshade family, which includes potatoes and tomatoes, that they really cause her arthritis symptoms to flare up. So the short answer is possibly, and it just depends on the individual. Again, we're all a little different, and we all have different, slightly different enzymes in all of our tissues, and so we may react differently to different plant foods. So you may in fact find that certain plant foods can make your joints hurt. I will say without question, the most likely sources of arthritis exacerbating foods are the animal foods, particularly dairy foods. Those will have you, in a wheelchair. But if you find a particular food doesn't agree with you, then just try to limit your exposure to it. And it's also really important that even when you think you're being super observant about what you're eating, to make sure you're reading those food labels, because I'm telling you, these people that do prepared foods, they will sneak in milk components like whey and stuff like that into a prepared product that you think is vegan, and they'll say plant-based, and you think that means vegan, but it really means vegetarian. So again, just make sure you're reading your labels properly to make sure it does not have any animal components whatsoever. But if you find that certain vegetables don't agree with you, those you just avoid. I personally, everywhere I go, I have a 10-foot pole with me that has eggplant written on it. I will not touch eggplant, but that's just because I don't like it.
So Dr. Mills, in that respect, how would you look at the discussion? Are we allergic to a plant? And if we are continuing to eat dairy and then we eat that plant and it causes us problem, could it actually be the dairy or the animal food that is what we are allergic to? And if we cut that out, that plant that we wanted to eat would be just fine.
Yes, I would say that if you're still continuing to eat dairy or some other form of animal food, I don't think you can know whether or not you're allergic to an actual plant until you get all of those allergy-inducing pro-inflammatory animal foods out of your diet first.
I could tell you that's what happened to us. We found a Mexican burrito shop that we really like their products and their burritos, their veggie burritos, and we wiped out the cheese and and so, but all of a sudden, my wife got seemingly an allergy to, oh shoot, what was it? Anyhow, I can't remember exactly what it was. She's on here. If she remembers, she might tell us. Anyhow, so what we looked at was there was an avocado sauce in that burrito. And that avocado sauce was made with mayonnaise.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
There's our egg. Yes.
Yeah.
And when we wiped out that avocado sauce, she hadn't had a problem since.
Yeah, I recently had a similar experience. I went somewhere and got something and thought I had eliminated everything, and then later that night my hips started bothering me, and when after I retraced everything, something I had bought earlier had whey in it, and I'm just like, but I was almost happy because it just pointed out how sensitive my body had become to these components now. You know what I mean? That your body will let you know when there's something you weren't supposed to ingest. And then it tells you what to avoid going forward. But again, and that's also just how inflammatory these animal foods are. They will make you hurt.
Yes. Any more questions?
I have one more question about baby aspirin. And
Sure.
if someone is on a plant-based diet, is that something that one should or shouldn't take?
I would say it depends on why you started it, and so because there's been some recent studies that have suggested that putting everybody on a baby aspirin, well, let me back up a little bit. So when it was shown that aspirin could lower the risk of having that terminal event in the heart attack sequence and lower the risk of people having a heart attack, doctor said, okay, everybody goes on aspirin after you reach a certain age. But when they, again, went back and reprocessed the data after about 15, 20 years, they realized that, a lot of people who were at fairly low risk for heart disease were ending up having bleeding problems and strokes from being on an aspirin they didn't need to be on. So they modified the recommendations to say that everybody shouldn't be on an aspirin, only those at high risk of heart disease. So I would therefore say that if someone, let's say someone who has been plant-based for 10, 15 years, turned 60 and said, well, now that I'm 60, I need to be on an aspirin, and started taking it, I don't think you do. However, if you're someone who, say, has been plant-based for 5 years and your doctor had evaluated you and decided that you needed to be on an aspirin because you had risk factors associated with heart disease, I would talk to that doctor and have them reassess whether you needed to stay on it. Because again, remember, those plaques get deposited over, 20 to 30-year period before they get to the point where they will cause the heart attack event in most people. When you become plant-based, assuming you're eating a healthy plant-based diet, that process does start to reverse, but it can typically take a good 5 to 6 years to get significant regression of those plaques. So I don't want people, if they've been put on aspirin because they have documented blockages, to precipitously stop that aspirin. But if you're just taking it because you thought, well, I need to, you may not need to.
I have a question.
Sure, Catherine.
Hey, Kathy.
Hey, well, basically, I would just say I was supposed to be on aspirin, and I ended up substituting that for CoQ10.
Okay.
And I haven't had any problems because it supposedly helps with your cardiovascular, et cetera, and it gives me more energy. So I started actually taking the coenzyme Q10.
Who, when you say I was supposed to be on aspirin, who told you that and why?
It was a doctor due to an event, a TIA event, because I didn't know my blood pressure was high, had no idea.
Okay.
And now it's at a manageable level.
Okay.
And I haven't had any more issues as far as that goes. So I started taking the CoQ10 instead.
Okay. All right. You asked me to do something that I'm really not supposed to do and that I don't like to do, but having said that,
yeah,
let me say what I would do. I technically can't tell you what you,
I know.
you should do.
I could have used a case scenario like I have a friend, but
yeah.
I mean.
No, but I don't disagree with what you're doing. And as long as you're doing a solid vegan diet, as long as you are managing your blood pressure, and it's really being well controlled, I think the CoQ10 is a good idea. I'd probably throw vitamin E in there.
Vitamin E?
Yep. And make sure that you're getting some mushrooms in your diet on a regular basis, because that'll also help regulate the way your blood clotting factors are managed.
Like cordyceps or reishi or something.
Actually,
like
it turns out any and all mushrooms will do. So just knock yourself out. Mushrooms are wonderful for our health.
What's the psilocybin though?
Yeah, and it turns out that most of the studies, because I was expecting to find out we needed the exotic mushrooms, right? Most of the studies showing the benefit has been done on the little white button mushrooms that we use in the salads. So wow. I'm like, yeah. So if those are good for you, the exotic ones must be fantastic. So yeah, so just eat what you want. And the other amazing thing is that the effects of one meal of mushrooms last a week and a half to 2 weeks.
What?
Yes. Check out my lecture on cancer, and it shows the actual graph. The effects start to they boost antibody production, and it starts to taper off after 1 week, which means that if you eat them on a regular basis, they keep that production up sky high. And I know I'm kind of going overboard here, but the type of antibody production they boost is secretory antibody, the antibody that's in your saliva, in your mucus, in your tears, the kind that protects you from things like COVID, from bacteria, from viruses, so that it actually prevents things from getting in your body. So yeah.
So what I've been doing, I do the CoQ10, vitamin C, vitamin D3, and zinc, etc. I have a plethora, not too many, but and I have found that it helps with my energy.
Yeah. And
so
I bet you
is
ain't
that
had no
lecture
colds either, right?
yeah, is that lecture on YouTube on the mushrooms?
It is. It's
Okay.
on. It's part of the lecture on cancer. Yeah. But
And you
and
have the
that
channel?
information, huh?
It's on your YouTube channel.
It's on my website, but it's also on just YouTube. You type in Dr.
Okay.
Mills cancer, it'll pop right up.
All right.
And the information is in both Dr. Furman's book on super immunity and on the book on mushrooms. So yeah, it's there.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
All right, cool. So I'll see you guys tomorrow.
Oh, I got another question.
One more question. Okay.
Question.
Go
On
ahead.
I'm sorry. Was you talking to me or was somebody else?
I was going to tap. No, you go ahead.
Okay. So I have a question on controlling high blood pressure. And I know that a plant-based diet is good for that. Is there one particular food or several foods that can help with that? And how long after being on a plant-based diet can you see some improvements?
I'm going to defer that question until tomorrow, because tomorrow we're going to start with hypertension.
Okay, cool.
Because it's nuanced, but we will explore that in detail.
Okay.
And that's the first topic. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
My question, Dr. Mills, is why do doctors, at least now, hesitate to have an ultrasound done of your carotid artery? And would you suggest that people get their carotid artery shot with an ultrasound so they can see what their arteries look like?
One of the reasons that they are somewhat reluctant to do it was because what they found was that when they were doing them willy-nilly in the past and they saw what they thought were significant narrowing, and then they would rush in and do these procedures, that they didn't get the results that they were expecting. That one, there were complication rates. That because when you go in and you start mucking around with that plaque, you can sometimes cause pieces to break off and cause a stroke. But that if they put a stent or something in, that it didn't necessarily affect the likelihood when they compared the people who had the procedure versus those who didn't have the procedure. It didn't make that big of a difference whether they did the procedure or not, up to a certain point. Okay. Now if you get like beyond like an 80% narrowing, that's a different issue. What they really didn't do stents in carotids. They did what's called endarterectomies, where they try to cut out the portion with the plaque in it, and then connect the two ends of the carotid. And so they just found that there wasn't a lot of correlation between X amount of plaque and what should be done. So that's why they're doing them less now, unless a person is really symptomatic.
Can I give you a little
so again, if you're symptomatic, yes, but if not, it's not a good correlation.
Can I give you a little history?
Sure.
It's interesting that the reason that they're not using that now is in the treatment of it through a procedure. Let me tell you what happened to me 17 years ago. We had a health seminar in Las Vegas in our church, and I had my carotid artery shot. It had 25% blockage. Now I was just coming off the farm. I was just out of the dairy business. I eat dairy, a lot of meat, a lot of cheese. But my wife, she didn't have anything. She had been vegetarian much longer than I have been.
Mm-hmm.
But what it caused me to do, because at the same time we learned what causes that plaque. So I began to change my diet.
Mm-hmm.
And 10 years later, I had it done again in Portland this time. And there was 15%. So I was going in the right direction, but
Right,
I hadn't gone to a completely whole food plant-based diet. We had another seminar that basically was saying we need to get on a whole food plant-based
Right.
diet. I did that. I wiped out the cheese. I wiped out everything animal. 5 years later, I had it done again, which is 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
They looked and they looked and they looked and they couldn't find any plaque on both arteries. But the indication is this is what all your arteries are looking like. It's just what you found. They just did it in the
Right.
carotid because it's easy to find.
Exactly. Yeah.
Why don't the doctors say, change what you're doing and get rid of that plaque?
Sadly, many of them don't realize that you can actually reverse plaque with dietary change. And that's just the tragic truth. That's why it's up to us to carry this information out to people. And your story is my God, I mean, if we could put that on a billboard, no, really, I mean, that's what people need to know and hear, because they won't hear it from their physicians. But it's the truth. And again, that's why we're doing what we do.
Wow. I have another question along those lines. If you got another minute, if somebody else has a question. The question I have in that, if you have a buildup in plaque, and if you are an athlete that is exercising either on the field or on the court, basketball court, tennis court, or anything where you are exercising and utilizing a lot, and you are eating animal products and eating the foods that start that plaque. With the epithelium cells that have to expand when you're exercising, right? So more blood can go. Does the plaque expand? Probably not. So
No,
you have
no, exactly. And in fact, that fat, and Dr. Esselstyn is really emphasizes this. The fat actually prevents the epithelium from causing the dilatation that these athletes need. And have you seen Game Changers?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, they talk about that one of the reasons plant-based diets actually improve performance for elite athletes is because their epithelium is able to cause their blood vessels to respond more effectively when their muscles need that extra blood flow and energy. And when your arteries are, as we saw in that little diagram I showed you, when they are filled with all that grease, that blood flow is sluggish and you can't get what you need to that exercising muscle, and it's going to impair your performance and recovery. And
how about the epithelium trying to expand, but the plaque won't let it, and eventually will be a rupture.
Right, exactly. And that's actually what happened to Jim Fixx. You remember he was Jim Fixx, he did Runner's Magazine, whatever that was. He died from a massive heart attack while he's out running one day.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's exercise will not undo the evils of a bad diet. And in fact, if anything, it can sort of precipitate a terminal event.
Any other questions? Thank you, doctor.
No problem. Okay, guys. Well,
yes. I got a quick question.
Sure.
What about for sensitive teeth? Lately, I've been struggling with, and I just don't know how to get rid of it or improve it.
Yeah, and I'm going to have to tell you, I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not saying there isn't an answer, because there are some plant-based dentists out there, but that is just something I don't know the answer to. But I would, you know, I try to Google it, see if there's any plant-based dentists who've addressed that question, because there may be some information out there on that. But I feel you on that sensitive tooth issue, because I've never been able to. My dad used to chew ice like it was candy, and if something cold touches my teeth, I'll jump out of a chair. So I feel you, but I don't know the answer to your question. Sorry. But what I was going to say to you guys is that almost certainly there are going to be questions that occur to you guys overnight. Please write them down so that we can go over them tomorrow. Because if you just try to remember them, you won't. But if you write them down and you have your list, we can review them tomorrow at tomorrow's session.
Boy,
Okay.
What a great opportunity we have, Dr. Mills, to have you back again tomorrow at 6 o'clock at the same link. And we thank everybody that's come. We hope you've been fully, how would you put it, enriched and encouraged by what Dr. Mills has been telling us. And we just need to come back and just receive more of that. We're letting the Lord work through him this weekend, and so we are glad to have him. Brother Derek, you are there. Can you unmute yourself and end us with prayer? You can't do it, huh? Oh, well then I'll end this with prayer if that's the case.
Okay.
Heavenly Father, we thank you.
I
Oh, there
got
you
it.
go. Okay, go
Oh,
ahead.
there you go. All right.
Father in heaven, we thank you so much for the knowledge that you've given us to take care of ourselves and how to take care of ourselves, how to prevent sickness. We don't have to be sick if we will only listen to you.
Amen.
We thank you for Dr. Mills coming and sharing this information for each and every one of us. And we're asking that you help us, Lord. We need your strength. We need your help to help us to say no and help us to say yes to the things that would glorify you in our bodies. So we're looking forward to Dr. Mills coming back tomorrow. We just pray that you fill him up and he can let it a whole lot more come out tomorrow. And we're thankful for the day. Amen.
Amen.
Good night, Dr. Mills.
All right. You guys have a good evening, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.
Right.
God bless.
Now, before
All right.
everyone leaves, on Saturday, on Sabbath, Dr. Mills will be talking about diet and the gospel. What
Yes.
food fornication means to our health and our healthy life.
Yes, indeed. All right. All right. You guys have a good night.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Bye.
You're welcome.
Bye,
All right.
everyone.
Bye-bye.